Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this 30-minute breakfast briefing with me, Kaz Carrington. The briefing is going to be on mental health in the workplace. Also on the webinar this morning is Melanie Whittle, who will be answering your questions as we go along. Thanks, Melanie. But don't worry if we don't get to answer your question. Please just email in at klc@klcemploymentlaw.com and we'll get back to you. Liv Harris from GoHo is in charge of technical support today. I always need that. Thanks very much, Liv. And fingers crossed that we can keep those tech goblins at bay. But, you know, who knows? If we do suddenly have a little glitch, don't worry, we'll get back as soon as we can. We're at the vagaries of, I say, those tech goblins. Okay, so on to the programme. This is what we're going to be looking at in the next little while. What is mental health? Obviously, this is so important at the moment. Since the pandemic, we've seen rises in issues with mental health problems at work. And when I say at work, I mean that in the loosest sense. A lot of people have been working from home, and that in itself, though can be very, very helpful to the individual, can also cause problems as well. Those sort of mental health issues could be hidden from the employer. So we'll look at what we mean by good mental health as well, the effects of the pandemic and the restrictions, because in many cases, the pandemic itself had little or sort of a small effect on individuals. Obviously, restrictions restricting people's ability to come to work, to meet family and friends, obviously had a lot of effect. What we can do to prevent possible poor mental health at work rather, and identify it. Poor mental health, what is it with regard to? Is it disability? Can it be a disability? When do we have to make reasonable adjustments? The issue of personal injury, I want to go back and remind us that we can fall into the trap of just focusing so much on making those reasonable adjustments, forgetting that there can be liability as well for personal injury. And just going to remind you how that works and what the tribunals and courts have laid down in terms of personal injury, how it can be run sometimes in tribunal, but it's mainly run as a civil claim in the civil courts. And finally, managing disciplinary issues and poor mental health. When people who are poorly commit acts of misconduct, what do we do? Can we go ahead with the disciplinary procedure? Do we have to make adjustments? When is it possible for us to say, well, actually, you know, that is something that's out with anything that's acceptable at work, and therefore we may have to move to dismiss, notwithstanding the fact that the person may have some form of mental illness. Okay, then, so what is mental health? ACAS define mental health in their guidance as something that includes our emotional, psychological and social well-being. So it kind of gives us a picture of what that might be, how we think, feel and act, and helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others and make choices. So it's the way we interact with other people, the way we can conduct our lives and, I guess, live happy lives. Now, clearly, some people suffer from serious mental illnesses. Obviously, that's out with my experience in terms of any sort of expertise, but we'd be talking about things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, which can be controlled and dealt with in terms of people being on the right medication. But clearly, that is something for the medical professionals. A lot of the time when we're talking about good mental health, however, we're talking about really people keeping at bay depression, anxiety, those types of conditions. So what is good mental health? What does it look like? Well, the World Health Organization state that it's a state of well-being in which every individual realizes their potential, they can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and are able to make a contribution to their community. So note there, can work productively and fruitfully. And obviously, you know, add on to that happily, we assume. People who are going to make not only a contribution to their workplace, but also to the community that they live in and serve. Okay, also, with regard to mental health, according to the Mental Health Foundation, it's not simply the absence of a diagnosable mental health problem. So when I talked earlier about those sort of serious types of mental illness like schizophrenia, etc., it's not just that. It's people who are possibly suffering from, anxiety, stress that is too much for them to cope with. It's not just the normal, oh, I'm going to do something, I'm a little bit excited, or the adrenaline sort of pumping a little bit. It's not that. It's stress that is overwhelming an individual's ability to carry on as normal. Again, according to Mental Health Foundation, good mental health characterized by a person's ability to fulfill a number of key functions and activities, and they include in those the ability to learn and feel and express and manage a range of positive and negative emotions. So it's kind of being able to deal with the good and the bad. So I'm sure that most of us could be very happy just to trot along in life if everything's going well. We might not have the most robust mental health, but we're able to cope. But it's those situations where we have to cope with the negative aspects of life. So this is where our good mental health kicks in, where a robust mental health helps us, because even when we're faced with the more negative aspects of life, it could be, I don't know, the loss of a job. It could be something happening in the person's personal life, like a bereavement or moving home or a divorce or any of those things, that we are able to cope. So that's what we mean by sort of good and robust mental health. And the ability to form and maintain good relationships with others, that's very important, isn't it, in the workplace as well as in our personal lives. Very often we hear with people who suffer from poor mental health and have problems at work, that there are issues with relationships with other colleagues. The person either feels that people are against them, or they feel that they have to make grievances against somebody because they are unhappy with the relationship. So really important, again, both at work and in our personal lives. And the ability to cope with and manage change and uncertainty now in these times, that is really key, isn't it? And again, this is why such an important issue right now, mental health, because we are living in a time when, touch wood, we are over the main effects of the pandemic. I say that, touching wood again, but it's the uncertainty, isn't it? We have the Omicron variant. What did that mean for people? Well, it looks like, touch wood again, that was something that wasn't going to affect people's physical health too much, but the anxiety of wondering what that would mean for people working in hospitality sector, people wondering whether that would mean a loss of the job. So these things are really relevant and highly important to us. So again, the effects of the pandemic that's had on mental health. So I mentioned people working from home, and in many situations you might be included in this. I'm working from home today. That's very nice. Sometimes it's great to be able to work in the comfort of your own home on a nice in a nice sort of environment when it's nice, horrible and sort of cold outside and you haven't got to slog into work. However, social interaction is very important for human beings. We all understand that and know that. And therefore, actually being confined to barracks, as it were, day in, day out, can have an effect on individuals' well-being. Again, concern about future employment. Perhaps for some people, spending time in their homes where they might not live alone, maybe. So maybe loneliness isn't an issue, but maybe that the person that they're living with, the relationship isn't good or strong, and it's an unhappy relationship. And of course, the more time spent at home means that the bad relationship, the effects of the bad relationship are exacerbated. Inability to have satisfying breaks from work. Often people say, oh, it's so trivial to want to go on holiday, Cass, what's the matter with you? Well, actually, we all do need a break from work, whether it's a weekend break, a la Bridget Jones, or whether it's a 2-week holiday, wherever you want to go. The idea of being able to get away and turn off from work is very important. And again, the issue that we've had in recent years is that even if you've managed to scrape away on holiday, it's always been the anxiety of, oh, are you actually going to make it? Is there going to be a restriction in place before you go to prevent you from enjoying your break? For some who have relatives abroad, and that's a lot of people in the UK, the inability to see those relatives. I mean, some people haven't seen relatives because of timings of restrictions, for a couple of years. And that's obviously going to build to make somebody feel unhappy and anxious about the future, and just sad that they're not seeing their relatives. So this general uncertainty of the future is heightening people's anxiety again, to making sure that this is something we're focusing on now in the workplace, and it's not something that we've just ticked a box with in previous years. What can be done? There was a report, and I talk about previous years because in 2017 there was a Stevenson Farmer review, a report undertaken by Lord Stevenson, who has been a lifelong campaigner for the recognition of mental health, both in the workplace and generally, how we recognise it, how we deal with it. And Paul Farmer, who's the CEO of Mind charity, and they undertook an extensive review of mental health, and it's called Thriving at Work. And these are some of the statistics that they uncovered, and they were shocked at the time to see how many people were affected by poor mental health and were losing their jobs, their careers each year. Also the cost to the government and to business and to the economy. Now, those sort of figures start to pale into insignificance when we look at the cost of the restrictions of the pandemic. But I mean, clearly we're looking at 2017. Now, this review, the Farmer Stevenson review, was actually looked at again in 2019. And the government, by the way, accepted all of the report's initiatives and ideas, in its entirety. So they said, yeah, these are good things. This is what we want to do. Now, in 2019, as I say, the review looked and said, okay, well, we've achieved some of these things, but there's still an awful long way to go when we're looking at mental health and the workplace. So what can be done? How can employers better to support their employees, their workers' mental health? Well, one of the key factors in the Stevenson Farmer report, Thriving at Work, was that all employers, regardless of sector, industry, etc., should adopt mental health core standards. Okay, so looking at those things which are really important to our employees and workers' mental health. So, for example, implementing a comprehensive mental health plan. So I'm sure all of you have done that. You've reviewed, you've looked, you've done a risk assessment, you've maybe done surveys to see what the temperature is in terms of people's mental health in your workplace. Actually developing awareness of mental health at work. So really sort of encouraging open discussion about the subject. It's a difficult discussion to have. I'm certainly not an expert, and maybe you are, I don't know. But, sometimes people are very closed about this. They're very protective of this sort of thing. They're worried that should they give over something of themselves and make themselves vulnerable, that in some way that would mean that they're no longer desirable as workers or employees. So encouraging this conversation and monitoring the health and well-being of our workers. So if you like, a greater understanding, a greater acceptance that this is a very important matter, destigmatizing, if I can put it that way, the subject, because however much we have moved on in terms of mental health in the workplace, there's no doubt about it that people are still fearful that, if I actually talk about the problem that I suffer from anxiety, or that makes me unhappy, or I've got depression, that in some way I won't get that promotion, or I'll be seen as somebody who's weak. So those are the sorts of matters that we have to really try and extinguish and help people to, I guess, improve their mental health, become more robust in terms of their mental health. Okay, what else do we want to say here? What can be done? I guess it's a culture that we have to develop. It's not always easy to do that. Sometimes we're starting from scratch. As I say, many of you will have already done a lot of work in these areas. But there's no doubt about it that, as I mentioned, the remote working issue has had an effect on people's well-being. Now, lots of people I speak to, and as you can imagine, I get to speak to a lot of HR managers, directors, business leaders. And lots of people say to me, oh, working from home is great, it's fine, we're handling it, oh, it's brilliant, we have meetings. But just be aware that sometimes people will try to hide issues that they're having, and it's easier to hide something if I'm on a Zoom call or a Teams call. It's much harder to hide it if I'm coming into the workplace. So we need to identify these issues and nip them in the bud. So things to be aware of. And these are the sorts of things that might be harder to identify when we're actually not seeing people in person, face to face. So personality changes we're told to look out for. So people who may become angry, aggressive, somebody who was an extrovert has become an introvert, or vice versa. Actually, somebody who is, usually quite quiet, who seems to be quite outlandish, and maybe something's going on there. Increased sickness absence. And again, this is something that is hidden for somebody working from home, because people are more likely to crack on and work from home regardless. Whereas if they've got to come into the office and they're feeling a bit poorly, they might not. They might have a day off if they're feeling a bit under the weather, if they feel anxious or depressed. So again, something to really make sure we can monitor. Again, the same goes for poor timekeeping and working longer hours. These are things which are visible to us if people are coming into work. People are working from home, again, even if they're only working from home for part of the week. Obviously, at the moment, most people are working from home if they can. That's the guidance from the government. Again, it's harder to be able to identify if people are struggling. Changes in appearance. People who are unhappy often really sort of stop bothering about their appearance. I have an acquaintance who suffers from poor mental health, and she is, the most fastidious of people. She's a beautiful woman, and yet when she's feeling poorly, she doesn't want to get out of bed, and she doesn't even bother showering. It's that sort of thing. So we need to keep an eye on those sorts of changes in appearance. People who are demonstrating odd behaviours, they might become obsessive. It might be about working, it might be about other things, it might be about controlling other people's behaviour. Those are sorts of things we should be looking out for. Again, what can be done? Now, clearly, our managers are never going to be a substitute for health professionals, mental health professionals, but we can get our managers to intervene, and we can get our managers, as you will probably already have done, some of you, trained to identify odd, different behaviours and be able to help, be able to ask the right questions. So again, Mind, Rethink charities who are well versed in understanding mental health issues run these types of courses. They might come into your organisation and talk to managers. And it's all about sort of asking the right sort of questions, isn't it? About how people are feeling, and asking in a way that isn't intrusive, asking in a way that isn't blunt and rude. And that's quite difficult, isn't it? Asking, how are you feeling today? You're looking blooming awful. I mean, clearly that's not going to be helpful, but the right inquiry with the right tone can help somebody to open up about their feelings and talk about problems they might be having. Okay, mental health, disability and reasonable adjustments. Again, clearly, we don't have to see a mental health problem being a diagnosable mental illness for it to be a disability under the Equality Act. You're all aware of that, clearly. So people who are suffering from acute anxiety, stress, where they're not functioning, where it meets the definition of disability. So the mental impairment, which could be the anxiety, let's say, it has substantial and long-term, it's going to last more than a year, or has lasted for more than a year. It's recurring adverse effect on somebody's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Again, somebody just having a little wobble and a bit of stress at work isn't going to mean that they're disabled under the Act. But somebody who is suffering from a condition where anxiety is something they're having to cope with, and maybe they're having some sort of therapy for. They're very likely to be considered disabled under the Act. If they're placed at substantial disadvantage, then Section 20 of the Equality Act is our duty to make all reasonable adjustments. Now, when we're talking about mental health issues, what might they be? Well, again, it depends how the person is presenting with their impairment. It could be that, we can look at the way work is done, the hours that work is done in. It could be that we may have to adjust certain policies because of a minor blip in their performance, for example. So it's the duty to make all reasonable adjustments. Remember, that duty will depend on the organization's size and resources available to it. So, it's not a broad brush here. It's a case of what would be right for us, but it's knowing how to deal with that in a sensitive way. And of course, remembering that it's not just Section 20, it's Section 15 as well. So it's those things arising from a consequence of somebody's disability. So, for example, if they had time off work, if their behaviour wasn't quite as we would want it to be, then that could be matters arising in consequence of disability. So that Section 15 has to be dealt with as well. And sometimes I know that is can be forgotten. So be aware of that too. So moving on to personal injury, and I said at the beginning, again, this is an area which sometimes we can forget about. I'm not saying that people will forget about their duty of care, but when it comes to mental impairments, people not having good mental health, then we can fall foul of the law, and we can fall foul of our duty of care. And this was really very well demonstrated. Quite a few years back now, when these cases in bold were actioned, and there's lots of cases with regard to personal injury. Now, as you will be aware, the duty of care of an employer is where we make sure that our employees are healthy, they're safe, and we make sure that we do nothing to impinge that duty. And if we are in breach of that duty of care, that means that we may be negligent, and we may be responsible for any injury that that person actually sustains. You may just have seen that I've sort of just slightly lost focus. It's because, as all things happen, the window cleaner is just cleaning the windows in my study. There we are. These things happen. So apologies for that. So the duty of care, all employees have a duty. And if we are in breach of that duty of care, then we may be sued by the individual for any injury that they sustain because of that breach. So what we're looking for with a civil claim is we are in breach of our duty of care. That breach led to the person's injury, and that injury was foreseeable. Now, in Walker versus Northumberland, which was actioned quite a while ago, a High Court decision, we see that Walker, who was a social worker, was dealing with a very high load of cases, and they were child abuse cases. So this was an individual who was doing a very stressful job. Now, he had a mental breakdown, for want of a better phrase. It was so awful, the amount of work he was doing, the sort of material he was seeing was so bad that he had a breakdown. He then came back to work, and he was promised that that workload would be lessened. He would have fewer cases to deal with. That didn't happen, and he had another breakdown. Now, the upshot of this case is that was the breach of the duty of care, was it foreseeable, his injury? Well, the first breakdown, no, it wasn't foreseeable. But the second mental breakdown, that was foreseeable. They knew that he was poorly, they hadn't reduced his caseload, and therefore they were responsible for that personal injury. And when it comes to personal injuries, this tends to run into hundreds of thousands of pounds. And Walker, I can't remember the exact remedy, but I think it was in excess of certainly in excess of 100,000 and more like £120,000. In Barber versus Somerset, here we have the House of Lords now trading as the Supreme Court. They talk about the duty of care, and they say generally when we're talking about this, we're talking about the conduct of the reasonable and prudent employer taking positive thought for the safety of its workers in the light of what is known or ought to be known. So refer that back to Walker. They might have known, they should have known that Mr. Walker was more vulnerable to having some sort of mental breakdown because they knew he'd previously had one. He was doing a very stressful job. Now, in itself, the courts will say no job is in itself too stressful to do. For example, being a brain surgeon, I'm sure, is very stressful. But actually, it's not so stressful that you would automatically think that somebody would have a breakdown from doing it. But if you know that somebody has had some sort of mental illness or impairment in the past, that may guide your actions as an employer in the future. And if you don't take account of that, then you can be liable for that personal injury. Okay, just remember that if somebody runs a personal injury claim as part of a discrimination claim in the employment tribunal, they will be sort of not capped out, but the remedy will be sort of governed by the Vento sort of bans. But if they run it as part of a discrimination claim, then they do not have to show that the injury was foreseeable. They just have to show that the, if you like, the breach of the duty led to the injury. It doesn't have to be foreseeable. Okay, so finally on to managing disciplinary issues and mental illness. You don't automatically exclude somebody from the procedure just because they're suffering from poor mental health. But what we are asked to do by the tribunals and the courts is really look and see, first of all, is there any connection between the person's poor mental health or their mental illness and the act committed? Now, clearly, if there is, then we should suspend any disciplinary action. We should take medical opinion in all situations, in any case, and see what the most appropriate action is. Sometimes there will be things that we can do other than taking disciplinary action. It could be that we can sort of recommend that after talking to the medics that somebody should maybe have a period away from work, or there's some sort of therapy, and we can see why there was an outburst or why there was a misconduct, and we can say, well, actually it's not appropriate to deal with it in a disciplinary way. We will deal with it in another way, but we're looking to see if there is that connection. So sometimes the adjustments are required. However, there are some situations where there is no connection, and the tribunals and courts will make that decision based on medical evidence, or they say, well, actually, just because that person had that impairment didn't mean that they would have that outburst. And sometimes, of course, when there is violence at play here, then we know that we don't have to just say, well, that's okay, just because you're suffering from a mental illness or you have poor mental health, you can be violent to somebody at work, because clearly the tendency to violent behaviour is something that's excluded from disability definition. And the courts have said, just because somebody is suffering from a mental illness does not, if you like, mean that they can just be violent or have violent outbursts to people at work. But again, we always take medical opinion. We always make sure that there's any adjustments, and if there are adjustments that should be made, we make them, or we will fall foul of the Equality Act. But again, do remember that personal injury matter as well. Okay, that's all I really want to say on the matter of mental health in the workplace, other than to say that obviously this is just a gloss over, a quick sort of dip into this subject, which is really important, always is, but especially right now. In the Law on Tour, the spring Law on Tour, which we're running in April, we're going to cover this in far more detail. So If you haven't already signed up, do sign up for that. We're doing face-to-face in-person events as well as a webinar. They are actually a one-day complete employment law update. So you can really brush up on your employment law. In a case law section, we go through issues which really explain and teach bits of the law to you that you might be a little bit weaker on than other parts. So it's a real learning day. Full documentation, it's CPD certified, so you have your CPD hours. If you want to know more, please visit our website, klcemploymentlaw.com, or give us a call to find out more. You'll find our phone number on our website, but if you want to jot it down now, it's 01483 415. I've completely forgotten the number. I'm very sorry. That sounds really crazy. But just have a look at our website to find out. I so rarely ring the number that I've actually forgotten it myself. So apologies for that. Okay, so we're at the end of our 30 minutes now. Thank you very much for listening today. I hope you have a good rest of the day. Keep safe, keep healthy, keep mentally well, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye for now.